Hello again. An enduring modern myth is the idea that our ideas of race were dreamed up by Europeans in the years following the Enlightenment in the late 18th century, and that the Romans and other ancient cultures across the world didn't think in those terms. In fact, you'll sometimes see it suggested that the whole idea of race is a European invention, and that the Chinese and the Indians, people in South America, had no idea at all about race. They didn't even have the very concept of ethnicity and race. We are told that race, as in separate ethnic groups, was definitely a European invention of the 18th and 19th centuries, and that it is this idea of separate human races which has caused so much trouble in the modern world. It's easy enough to propagate such a falsehood because few people ever stop to ask if what they're being told is true. For instance, much has been made of Charles Darwin being a racist in the modern meaning of the expression. This is often achieved by ignoring the meaning of the word race as it was used in the 19th century. To give one example of this, the full title of the book we usually call The Origin of Species is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favoured Races in the Struggle for Life. There you are, you see. What does he mean by talking about the preservation of favoured races? He's clearly referring to white European as a favoured race. Actually, of course, race at the time that Darwin was writing was used to refer to different breeds of domestic animals, such as horses or sheep. One could talk of the race of sheep and how to improve it. So when Darwin talks about natural selection and the preservation of favoured races, he's actually comparing the process of breeding animals as directed by humans. So when we breed a sheep to give better wool or a horse to be stronger or larger, with the process as it takes place naturally, natural selection versus breeding. But of course, these days, that's not what race is meant to convey, so we find it a little bit confusing. Because of this, anybody trying to read what was written about race in Victorian Britain will automatically be very likely to get hold of the wrong end of the stick. In the description to this video, I give a link to a perfect case of this kind of idiotic misunderstanding. Somebody has written a piece headed, "Yes, Charles Darwin was a racist," and it contains this sentence. There is also the language of favoured race in Origin of Species, but the language wouldn't have raised an eyebrow in the 19th century. Here you see is somebody who thinks that the word race, when he reads it, is a 19th century idea and that it means exactly the same as we mean today by race. He's looking at a book title from the middle of the 19th century and assumes at once that it's a reference to human beings rather than animals. But hang on a minute, I seem to hear you say. Surely people did talk about human races at that time? Well, yes, they did sometimes, but they didn't mean at all what we now mean by the word. Race was used interchangeably with nationality, a practice which was still going strong well into the 20th century. I give a link in the description to this video to an article which appeared in a magazine called The Scientific Monthly in 1925, which is less than 100 years ago. The title of the article is "Will the French Race Become Extinct?" Now this really does sound odd. The French race? Surely French is a nationality rather than a race. You might as well speak of the English race or the Dutch race. And actually, of course, that is exactly what people did used to say. Race was synonymous 100 years ago with nation. You could talk of the English nation or the English race, the French nation or the French race. It meant exactly the same thing. As late as 1925, you see, race had still not acquired the meaning that we today give to it. The extinction of the French race was simply a way of asking if in the post-World War One world, the French nationality would survive as a separate identity. Today, of course, talking about the extinction of a race would sum up the idea of genocide. I've given two instances of the way in which the use of the word race has changed over the last 200 years. This is the background for those claims which we often hear that racism has its roots in the 19th century and that this was when ideas of race first emerged clearly and were used as justification for colonialism and slavery. It is complete nonsense. Race simply didn't have the connotations which we now associate with the word. I suppose that the question viewers might be tempted to ask now is, why doesn't everybody know this? How come people don't realise that in the 19th century the term race simply meant breeds of farm animals or pets? Why are we not told that as late as the 20th century race was just another word for different European nationalities? There are two explanations for this. The first is, of course, sheer ignorance. Many of those talking about the history of racism and the concept of race simply do not know enough about the past to provide accurate information on the subject. The second point is that it is a very popular narrative that now exists, which is to say tying in imperialism and the slave trade to some supposed theory of race, which was supposed to have existed in the 18th and 19th century. Viewers will perhaps have observed that anti-racists are usually very careful to avoid being pinned down about what they actually mean by racism. The same thing applies to race. Attempts to explore the subject are usually brushed aside with the stock response that race is a social construct. You will not find many anti-racists who wish to talk in depth about the history of race or what was meant by the word 100 or 150 years ago. This would be a little awkward for the reasons which I outlined earlier. The entire modern idea of race and racism has only been around for a relatively short time. Certainly less than a century ago, people meant something quite different by the word race from what we now understand the word to mean.